Okay, so today we have Cathryn Katie H. Greenberg. She is a research ecologist with the Upland Hardwood Ecology and Management Research Work Unit, USDA Forest Service Southern Research Station at Bank Creek Experimental Forest in Asheville, North Carolina. She received her MS from the University of Tennessee and her PhD from the University of Florida, where she studied the ecology of sand pine scrub in the Ocala National Forest. Am I saying it right?
Ocala, yeah.
Ocala, okay, Ocala National Forest. Her current research focuses on developing information and tools that are useful to forest managers and planners. Research areas include the effects of prescribed fire and wildlife, mixed oak regeneration harvests, and other forest management practices on reptile, amphibian, and breeding bird communities. So something that I know that many members of our community are going to be interested in. The production of forest food resources, such as native fleshy fruits and hard mass in relation to forest types and silvicultural disturbances, as well as long-term monitoring of amphibian populations in longleaf pine, wiregrass sandhills in relation to forest health and climate change. She has co-authored 2 books, Early Successional Habitats, Natural Disturbances, and is currently working on a 3rd focused on fire ecology and management in U.S. forests. So a big thank you to you for being with us today. Really appreciate you joining our department virtually over Zoom.
Thank you. And the books are not co-authored, they're co-edited with contributors from many wonderful professionals, including Mary Arthur and your faculty. Okay, so today I wanted to talk about, I got something on my screen here, but can you see these little blocks that are popping up on mine?
I cannot. You can go ahead. Those are just people coming into our waiting room, and I will admit them when that happens.
Okay. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about fire and wildlife in the Southern Appalachians and using a host of studies that I've done with many different people. So there are tons of contributors to this. But today, since I had a little extra time compared to some seminars, 10-minute seminars, I thought I'd give you a little overview of my work unit. I work for the U.S. Forest Service for a work unit called the Upland Hardwood Ecology and Management Unit. And our mission is to develop and disseminate knowledge and strategies to restore, manage, and sustain the vegetation and wildlife of upland hardwood forest ecosystems. And our goal is to help provide land managers with science-based information and methods to meet their management, conservation, and restoration goals. So we do applied research for informed management, basically looking at silvicultural methods to attain forest management and ecosystem restoration objectives across a complex topographic and geological gradients, and to understand how management actions and natural disturbances affect plant and animal communities. So the Forest Service does a lot of research, and that's what I'm going to talk about today, is a little bit of that. So it's basically wildlife species diversity reflects diverse conditions within stands and across landscapes. That's fairly well established in ecology. And diverse conditions in our forests, I'm mostly focusing on the Southern Appalachians today, both historically and today, are the result of disturbances. So if you're talking about natural disturbances, not including humans, our disturbance types, the predominant one is just background tree death, just occasionally here and there, tree fall gap dynamics. But then there's also slightly bigger disturbances, such as drought that kills more trees, especially oak decline, for example. Windstorms, tornadoes, ice storms, insect outbreaks, debris avalanches, wildlife, especially historically, beavers and grazers such as elk and bison even were a disturbance source on our landscape, and occasionally lightning ignited wildfires. And the main disturbance regimes differ geographically across the US for sure, but even within our central hardwood region, for example, we have more tornadoes toward the western part of the central hardwood region, and more wind disturbances, not actual hurricanes, but impacts from hurricanes toward the east, and landslides that are resulting from that and the topography. And we have greater fire return intervals, or more frequent fires toward the west, where the conditions are more conducive, and more ice storms and freezing rain toward the east. So natural disturbances are not the same all over. And they differ among ecosystems mediated by weather, lightning frequency, ignitability, topography, soils and water holding capacity, fuels, forest type, fire history, and prior land use. So there's a lot of things that go into fire regimes across the central hardwood region and the US. They're not definitely very different depending on where you are. But here, lightning ignited fires are actually relatively uncommon in upland hardwood forests, and that's because we have lower strike frequency than some places in the coastal plain. Our lightning is often accompanied by rain, so the fuel conditions are moist. Usually, longer droughts are required for lightning to ignite fires, or for humans to ignite fires for that matter. And also, in many places of our generic upland matrix, the fuel loading is relatively low, and that in other places it's higher, for example, on poor quality sites such as dry ridges or south or southwest facing slopes. So because those are lower quality sites, there tends to be more fuel buildup, and that is where a lot of our yellow pines probably historically were and still are today, partly because they are low quality sites and partly because of the slightly higher fire frequency in those positions. So here's 40 years of data from the Forest Service records showing that most wildfires are human caused. That's arson, campfires, cigarette butts, and so on, and a teeny fraction are lightning ignited. So when we talk about fire suppression, I think it's important to make it clear that what we are suppressing, at least in the central hardwood region, is usually human ignited wildfires. So we set the fires either accidentally, or if they're wildfires, they're accidentally, or arson, and then we put them out, and we call that fire suppression, which is different from fire exclusion, which I take to mean as just not actively putting fire into the ecosystem like was done historically, which I'll get into in a minute. Historically, we actively set fires on purpose. Today, we accidentally or by arson do it and then put them out, and those are two different things. So when we're talking about forest restoration, people are often seeking a reference condition, and the vision is sometimes, depending on your stakeholder group that you're talking to, a pristine, undisturbed landscape without the influence of humans. But that, around here at least, is basically impossible to ascertain because this was not even upland hardwoods. It was a completely different ecosystem just 12,000 years ago. The glaciers never came quite this far, but they made it very cold here. So we had a lot of tundra, jack pine, spruce. The wildlife was very different, and humans arrived right around that time as well. So the animals were completely different during the Ice Age. We had giant stag moose, ground sloth, mammoths, mastodon. It was just completely foreign landscape to what we picture today. So it's pretty hard to use pre-human as the reference condition because this is what it was like pre-human, and humans were moving in just as it started to change. The climate has changed, obviously, and it's gone from cold and fits and starts. It's shifted to warm and humid, which it is now. And over that time period, it slowly shifted to oak, pine, hickory, which we see today. And this was widespread by 3,000 years ago, at least. At the same time, because of the climate change and changing vegetation, most likely, most megafauna went extinct and human populations were increasing. So Native Americans have used fire to manage the land and been fairly abundant on the landscape for at least 3,000 years. And they used fire for many purposes, including to clear for fields and villages, to manage for game, to facilitate movement, and so on. And we know that fire frequency increased as human populations in Native American populations increased. This is from a publication by Guyette. And we also know they created different successional conditions because where they might clear, then they would, if the agricultural fields became infertile, they would abandon them and move. And so there would be successional habitat in the abandoned fields, and they would create new ones. So they created a mosaic of different kinds of earlier successional habitats. And archaeological evidence shows that in the year 1500, that's before Euro-American influence, humans impacted a huge part of the southeastern landscape. So the black dots are where there's direct archaeological evidence of where human villages were. And then the grayer areas surrounding are where their footprint was, and that probably includes fire. And the early Euro-American explorers described very different landscapes, which were probably somewhat biased because they were traveling through the easier places to travel. But where they were, they described open and clear woods, cultivated valleys, plains, and even endless savannas. So these were definitely, by most accounts, very different landscapes. And this probably wasn't uniform across the whole Southeast, but it was definitely in places that were heavily human inhabited. And I can't even see my notes because these boxes are covering up my words, but basically we have a lot of species of animals here. Thank you. That use habitats, early successional and young forest varieties, so to speak, that were and still are mainly created by humans, suggesting that humans are and were a keystone species. So these species could not have been here in very great abundance, at least, without the presence of humans. For example, we have species that require open canopy grass, shrub. These species, such as quail, used to be abundant in the mountains, according to historic accounts. We have meadow larks that need grasslands. We have golden-winged warblers that need a mixture of shrubs and grasses, and so on and so forth, that indicate that, of course, we don't know what the populations of these species were historically, but if they were here, they would have had to have had these habitats available. And very likely they were available for the last several thousands of years. But regardless of how these forest variants were created, we use fire today for many reasons, fuel reduction and many other purposes, at least as our stated goals. But when you talk about restoration, we're trying to restore, I think it's important to clarify that what we're trying to restore in many cases is managed conditions that were managed by Native Americans and later managed by the early settlers who used to also light the forests on fire. So if we're trying to reattain those shortleaf open woodland conditions, I think in most cases it's important to acknowledge that in most cases they were managed conditions. And we know that fire, regardless of how it's ignited, creates a variety of conditions across the landscape. So today I'm going to talk about a medley of studies, just each very briefly, that kind of put together pieces of the puzzle of fire ecology that have helped me to have a better understanding of how it works here in the central hardwood region, and especially in the mountains. I'm going to talk about one season of burn study, one that looks at prescribed burning compared to shelterwood harvests, one that looks at high severity burning and repeated burning compared to low severity or low intensity repeated burning, one on a mixed severity wildfire in the Nantahala, and then one on shelterwood harvests and how they change over time. That's not a burn study, but I think it's informative. So first, I'm going to talk about wildlife response to fuel reduction treatments in the Southern Appalachians. This is part of the National Fire and Fire Surrogate Study that Tom Waldrop was instrumental in developing and was the director of the Southern Appalachian site, which is where I worked with my partners on most of the wildlife studies. In that study, we had a mechanical understory reduction treatment that was done twice over the course of 16 years. We had repeated low intensity burns that were done 4 times over the course of 16 years. We had a mechanical thinning followed by a burn and then 3 more burns, so a total of 4 burns over the 16 years. And then we had controls. This was done in the Green River Game Lands, and our Game Land North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission folks were wonderful partners. So what I wanted to point out is in the burn-only treatment, most of these repeated burns were your routine, low-intensity dormant season burns that burned relatively low intensity and mainly affected the understory. Whereas the mechanical burn treatment, the MB treatment, where the fuels were thinned and let lay for a year before the fire was, on purpose or not, high severity. It was much hotter, and what I'm going to talk about subsequently will show that most of the differences that we see were in the MB treatment, and that's probably because it was a high severity burn. So both the burn treatments briefly reduced shrub stem density, but as you can see, it comes back quickly. This has implications for fuel management too, as the shrubs may be temporarily reduced, but they come back with the ferocity. Leaf litter also was reduced by both fire treatments, but as in our deciduous forests, as leaves drop each fall, the leaf litter is generally replenished. So it's not a very long-lasting fuel reduction or habitat change. And the hot fires in the MB treatment, the high severity treatment, killed a lot of trees. And we see a delayed effect. So over time, there more and more trees are dying. I don't know if it was exacerbated by these subsequent burns, but it might have, I think likely it was just mainly promoted by this first high intensity burn. But over time, more and more trees died. And of course, because of that, snag density increased as the trees died. But over time, they fell, so they were not a long-lasting component of the habitat either. And just a picture to see in the burn-only treatment, even after the third year, you can see it is letting a little more dappled sunlight, and there was a tiny bit of delayed tree mortality over the course of 4 low-intensity dormant season burns. But it didn't have a huge effect on the light coming in or a lot of the understory compared to the mechanical burn, so high severity burn treatment. And here you can see it's very, very different. It killed, here's pre-treatment, and then after the third burn, you can see that it's dramatically different kind of forest. So we did breeding bird sampling using 50-meter point counts. And as you can see, the green line shows the MB treatment, the high severity burn treatment, and there was a huge increase after a short delay, again, in the abundance of breeding birds and in the species richness of breeding birds. Whereas in the other treatments, you don't see that. You see a few weird little spikes in the burn, but it wasn't significant. And it's probably because a disturbance-dependent species like a bunting came into a gap that was created here and there by delayed mortality of the trees. But it wasn't significant, and the huge difference is in the high severity burn treatment. And this is notable for the disturbance-dependent species, where you can see they came in and they lasted because the subsequent fires maintained the open canopy condition. The stump sprouts that were coming back did not ever grow very high because we had repeated burns. So all these disturbance-dependent species remained in the treatment where the canopy was substantially reduced, which is the high severity burn treatment. But many species did not seem to care very much. They were generalists. They were equally as abundant in all the treatments, which is probably part of the reason the species richness went up in the high severity treatment, is because many species stayed, but a lot of disturbance-dependent species came in to the high severity burn treatment, but not to the other ones. So that added up to more species. And then a few did not declined, at least the short term, in response to the burning, and a lot of these are ground nesters. But they did rebound after a few years, and you can see the pattern after each burn, they did go down again. And this is particularly notable for the ovenbird, and maybe for the hooded warbler, it was a little bit less clear, which is a shrub species. We also did reptile and amphibian sampling using drift fences with pitfall traps. This was done with a couple of different master's degree students in NC State. And we found that the only discernible pattern was lizards that increased in the high severity burn. Once again, it's the green bars, the high severity burn site, where we're seeing the differences. It's interesting that we do see a weird little spike in salamander captures after each burn in the burn only treatment, in the low intensity burn treatment. I think that might be because it stimulated activity and they were just caught more, but I don't even think it was significant. And you don't see that in the MB. But we certainly didn't see a substantial or significant decline. And the two lizards that we saw increase in the MB treatment were 5-line skinks and fence lizards. Looking at the next study, response to oak regeneration treatments. This is called our regional oak study, and it's a partnership among many people, and done at the Cold Mountain Game Lands, which is also North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission. We have 4 treatments, including a prescribed burn, dormant season, regular old burn, a Shelterwood burn treatment, which is the Brose treatment, but this study doesn't, what I'm talking about today doesn't encompass the burn part, so it was just a Shelterwood for what I'm going to talk about. And then we have a mid-story herbicide, it's called the oak Shelterwood treatment, and controls. All of these are designed to help regenerate oak, and we're testing to see whether they work as well in highly productive sites in the mountains. So as you can see, the forest structure does change after the treatment, after some of the treatments. Density of trees went down in oak Shelterwood, or the mid-story removal herbicide, and the Shelterwood. But really it was just small trees that were taken out here, whereas the large trees were taken out in the Shelterwood. So you don't see the same pattern for the basal area. The basal area was not different in the oak Shelterwood mid-story herbicide treatment, but of course it was where you took out many of the trees in the Shelterwood harvest. And there we did strip transects to survey the breeding birds. And we see a similar pattern where the canopy cover was heavily reduced. In the last study, it was heavily reduced by high severity burning. In this study, it's heavily reduced by a Shelterwood harvest. And you can see that is where we see an increase in density and an increase in species richness of breeding birds. This is, the red is pre-treatment, and then post-treatment is the other 2 bars. And you can see by 2 years post-treatment or so, you have a huge response by breeding birds. And we see also here the same pattern as in the last study, where a lot of species generalists don't seem to respond very much to the treatments, but the disturbance-dependent species respond to the Shelterwood. They're not responding to the burn, and that's because this is a low-intensity burn. It didn't really affect the overstory much, and we're not seeing a big response by the wildlife either, but we are in the Shelterwood harvest. Once again, it's by the same general suite of species. We see that some species don't seem to care very much whether the overstory is substantially reduced, whereas the disturbance species do care. Sorry, I'm anthropomorphizing. They come in after the reduction in canopy, and then some, I can't actually see, I think this is ovenbird, decreases in the Shelterwood harvest. And just like it did in the mechanical burn treatment, in the high severity burn treatment I just talked about, where you reduce the canopy, and probably it has to do with leaf litter reduction too, because they are ground nesters. So looking at reptile and amphibian response, this was also done by several different grad students at NC State and University of Texas, actually. Again, we see a increase in lizards in the Shelterwood harvest, which is the yellow bars. And salamanders here, we did see a response, and this has been shown in other studies as well, that they do not, they decrease in response to Shelterwood harvests or substantial canopy reduction. But it was a delayed response, so this was post-harvest. And we didn't see a big decrease, but within a couple of years we did. So moving on to the next study, it's a season of burn study done at Benton Creek Experimental Forest in cooperation with the Pisgah National Forest. And we did growing season burns. We only were able to do 1 set of burns. So 1 growing season burn in late April, 1 dormant season the following dormant season, which was early March. And we had unburned controls in a replicated design. So again, we see that, as you might expect, leaf litter is decreased in after the burns, but it recovers pretty quickly. Shrub cover is also decreased after burning, but it increases very quickly. And canopy cover wasn't reduced very much by either the growing season or the dormant season burns, except by the last year there was a little bit less canopy cover in the growing season burns, and that's probably because there were some hot spots. It was higher temperatures, air temperatures. It's probably made the fires burn a little bit hotter, at least in some places, but it wasn't really, I don't even think it was significant, and it wasn't substantial. So we did strip transects to sample birds in that study as well. And again, the overstory was not affected, and not surprisingly at this point, because we've seen how the last 2 studies I've talked about, There was not a response in the number of birds or the abundance or in the species richness. And this is likely because the forest structure, at least in the overstory, did not change very much, and the understory changes were quite transient. We saw a little bit of effect on lizards again. 5-line skink abundance increased in the growing season burns, but not in the dormant season burns. And I think that's probably because of those hot spots and there was a little bit lighter, warmer conditions. Lizards are ectotherms and they tend to like warmer, probably more open places. Moving on to the next study. This is a study of the 2016 wildfires that occurred throughout much of the southern Appalachians. And we are looking at a mixed severity wildfire in the Nantahala National Forest. We looked at, this is a cooperative study with Coweta, who actually established the study, and then we piggybacked onto it with birds with my partner Chris Moorman from NC State and Mark Hopi from the Southern Appalachian Raptor Research Center. We picked 3 burned watersheds that each had mixed severity fires that burned across a gradient of conditions, and 3 unburned watersheds. We're still doing this study, it's not done yet, 50-meter point counts across the fire severity gradients and in the watersheds that were controls. And today I'm going to show you the first 3 years of preliminary data, where again you can see that as fire severity increases, it looks like species richness is also increasing, and it looks like abundance is also increasing with greater severity fire. These are preliminary data, so I'm not going to dissect it or anything. But once again, we also see that ovenbirds, let's see, this is post-fire, all of it's post-fire. So red-eyed vireo don't seem to care very much. Ovenbirds, it's hard to say, but in this case, it doesn't necessarily look like they're declining, but we'll see. I'm not really certain of this. I would expect them to decline with higher fire severity, as we've seen in the other 2 studies I just discussed. But disturbance-dependent species, as you might expect, are going up in the higher fire severity categories. The last study I wanted to briefly talk about is a long-term study of shelterwood harvests in COVE and upland hardwood southern Appalachian forests. And we had 15 shelterwood harvests that were harvested in about 1999 and 16 controls. They were divided into COVE and upland hardwood and also unharvested and harvested. And I'll probably end up lumping the 2 forest types when I do analyze these data, because this is also preliminary data in the sense that I haven't published it yet or looked at it carefully. But as for now, I have the 2 forest types split out, what I'm going to show you today. We also did strip transects in this study, and we did it for intermittently 16 years after the harvest. And we see that these 2 lines, the brown and light yellow, are the shelterwood harvests of the 2 forest types. But as I said, I'm probably going to lump them in the end. But as you can see, the trends are similar. We see much higher abundance of breeding birds in the shelterwood harvests compared to the controls, and we see greater species richness in the shelterwood harvests compared to the controls. Again, we're seeing the same pattern we saw in the other studies, where the canopy is substantially reduced. We see increases in the number of species and the number of birds. But interestingly, because we were able to follow this over the long term, and it was not repeatedly burned, as in the first study I told you, where you maintained the open conditions, it was allowed to grow up as it normally would. Over time, these trends converge, and so they get back to how they were initially in the controls. For example, the abundance of breeding birds and the richness of breeding birds goes down in the shelterwoods as the forest grows up. And we see again that the species differ in their responses. Disturbance-dependent species, chestnut-sided warbler, was much more abundant in both shelterwood treatments compared to the 2 control forest types. But it goes down as the forest grows up. So does the towhee, and so does the indigo bunting. What I think is really interesting is perceive the forest as becoming unsuitable or not open enough for them at different times, which the indigo bunting leaves or is no longer very abundant much earlier than some of these other species. But all of them decline within eight or 10 years-ish of the Shelterwood harvest. So these are transient conditions as the forest grows up. And once again, the red-eyed vireo doesn't really care. Probably true with a lot of the other more general species. And ovenbirds showed the opposite response again, where they were more abundant in the controls than they were in the Shelterwoods. But again, over time, they're beginning to rebound as well. So what is it about these open forest conditions? Well, there's reduced canopy cover is the most obvious one. Where more light is coming through, there's probably more primary productivity, which probably attracts bugs, maybe more flowering by the plants when they're opened, when the canopy's opened up. That might attract insects. There's very thick cover for animals to hide in. And we know there's more native fruit production as well. This is, we also tracked fruit production in these Shelterwood harvests and controls, and we see that it gets like 5 to 19 times greater within a year, a couple of years of harvesting. This is all kinds of native fleshy fruits compared to the controls, but it goes down within 10 years also as forests grow up. So I like to point out that forest health, Ellen and I were talking about this yesterday briefly. It's a relative term because different species require different conditions. So what's healthy for one condition or one set of goals, for example, a forester's goals, might be different from what is healthy from an indigo bunting's perspective or a lizard's perspective. So it's important to think about all taxa when managing forests and at least understand what their requirements are and compared to the management objectives. So just in summary, taken together, this kind of medley of studies show patterns of responses to forest structures created by fire or by silviculture. First, canopy cover appears to be the primary driver of wildlife response, with reduced cover resulting in more birds and more species of birds. But species respond differently. Some increase, some decrease, and some don't really care much, depending with canopy cover reduction. So there's no one prescription that's good for everything. There wasn't a whole lot of response to shrub or mid-story removal, whether it was mechanical in the one study or whether by herbicide in the other study. There's not much response to low-intensity dormancies and burns if the canopy cover is left intact. So when people talk about burning to promote wildlife habitat, it really ain't so, at least for what I've discussed today. It doesn't do much. If you want to improve, quote, improve wildlife habitat, first you have to define what you're improving it for. Which species are you talking about? Because it won't improve it for everything, no matter what you do. But secondly, recognize that low intensity winter burns don't do much for much of anything. And there was little response. Dormant versus early growing season didn't make much of a difference. It was still low intensity burns, and it didn't do much in terms of the wildlife community or the canopy cover. We learned that repeated low intensity burns could slightly increase bird species richness, but it wasn't significant. As I showed you, there were a few spikes because of little gaps that were created by hot spots, but low intensity dormancies of burns don't do much. But there was a huge response to high severity burns that killed a lot of trees, both by birds and by lizards. We learned that terrestrial salamanders decline after Shelterwood harvests, but don't really seem to have nearly as clear of a response, if any, to the high severity burning, which is interesting. And open forest conditions don't last that long. They grow quickly, less than 10 years following disturbances, and this could possibly be, the regrowth could probably be kept knocked back by repeatedly burning. That's one thing that repeated burning could do. And forest management and natural disturbance can create open forest conditions used by many species, including disturbance-dependent birds and some lizards. So these are some papers that about what I talked about today, some of the studies, if you're interested. And that concludes my study. My talk. Thank you.